Hello, and welcome to Music Stuff with Spock, and part 2 of our look at big chords and clusters. In part 1, we looked at the construction of triads and other chords, and how to make those chords bigger through using octave transpositions and by using extensions to the basic triad. We looked at making chords with intervals other than a third, and then we looked at the concept of how the dissonance or consonance of the chord had something to do with the relationship of the intervals that make up that chord. When we look at these structures, whether it is a triad, a four-part chord, a larger chord, or a cluster, the brain hears that sound in a number of different ways. One is it takes all the sounds and it puts it into a conglomerate sound of sorts. And over time with ear training, we can recognize these chords by their combination. However, at the same time, what's happening is the brain is analyzing each one of the notes and the different frequencies in those notes and comparing them all. So the overall feeling of consonance or dissonance and the emotional feel of the chord, to a great extent, has to do with the individual interactions of every note, which create a set of intervals. So today we're going to continue on with that, and we're going to look at a couple of chords and the interactions that make them up. If we look at the major 7 chord in terms of all the intervals that make up that chord, first there's a series of thirds. A major third, on top of which there is a minor third, and on top of that there is a major third. These are all consonant intervals. In terms of fifths, we have 2 perfect fifths, which are open and consonant as well. The only dissonant interval is the major 7. There's the boundary notes between the root and the top note. Now, if we compare this to the minor 7 chord, we see that it has a very similar makeup. It is built out of thirds, a minor third, and then above that is a major third, and then a minor third. In terms of fifths, we still have 2 perfect fifths. And the only really dissonant interval in the chord, again, is the outer 2 notes, which comprise a minor 7th. The minor major 7 chord and the major 7 sharp 5 chord are functionally very different chords, but they have a very similar dissonance level. In terms of the intervals that make up the chord, we have 3 thirds, a minor third, a major third, and then another major third. In terms of fifths, though, the bottom fifth is a perfect fifth, and the upper fifth is an augmented fifth. The outer 2 notes make a major 7th. And so the dissonant structures in this chord are the upper augmented fifth, the major 7th, and the top 3 notes make an augmented triad. When we compare this to the major 7 sharp 5 chord, we see that it has the exact same intervallic makeup, only the intervals are in a different order. The augmented triad is on the bottom half of the triad. The outer 2 notes still comprise a major 7th. The thirds are the same, 2 major thirds and a minor third, only in a different order. The intervals are upside down from where they are in the major minor chord. Any chord or structure can be analyzed in this manner, and when we use that to look at clusters and some of these large chords, we see why they are such complicated sounds. They have so many different interactions. If you have a cluster that's based on dissonant intervals, or a large chord that's based on dissonant intervals, the interactions start to pile up. Now, this concept can also go part way to explaining why big chords with just octave transpositions sound the way they do as well. If I have a major triad, and I just put a couple of roots on top of that, the interactions are all relatively consonant. If, on the other hand, I play just simply a first inversion major triad, that's a very complicated sound, because we hear the 3 notes fit together in a major triad, but the bottom intervals, the bottom interval is a minor 6, and that sets up a neurological conundrum. because this is a major chord, but the bottom interval, which is usually perceived as the most important interval for that, is a minor one. So that's why we hear that as dissonant. One of the things that we get out of looking at chords in this way is the idea that the construction of chords is not solely dependent on a scale or a mode or its chromatic variations, but chords can be constructed out of just intervals themselves. One of the first composers I noticed that built chords in this way was Edgar Varèse back at the beginning of the 20th century. I'd look at some of the stuff he'd written and I go, oh, that's a neat chord, and I'd try to analyze it in terms of a chord structure, and it didn't make any sense because it was just a bunch of sevenths stacked up on top of each other. And I didn't really understand this until I started writing more 12-tone music. My early 12-tone pieces tried to fit things into chords and harmonic structures as well, and what you have to do when you're writing 12-tone is just think in terms of intervals. Your row is made out of intervals, your melodies are made out of intervals. When you have different melodies coming together, the combinations make intervals. If you want to write a chord, you make them out of stacks of intervals. So, let's take a look at making some chords out of intervals. First, here's a fairly stock sci-fi background chord. It's based on a progression of fourths, an augmented fourth, then a perfect fourth, then an augmented fourth, then a perfect fourth for however high you want. Every other note in the structure makes a major seventh, so it's got a fair amount of dissonance, but because it's made out of fourths, it's somewhat ambiguous. You frequently hear this played on strings. So let's make a chord with dissonant and consonant intervals. Let's have a major 7 in it, and we'll have a perfect fifth, and maybe a major or minor 6, and an augmented fourth. Large chords like clusters are frequently relegated to keyboard instruments and the string section because the string section can be divided and individual strings can play the individual notes. And the sound of the instruments, from the violin to the viola, from the viola to the cello, is not that dissimilar. Whereas with the wind section, the sounds of the instruments is very different. The sound of the trumpet and the other brass is very different than the woodwinds. And even amongst the woodwinds, the different ranges, the different types of instruments, you have a great difference in timbre. So if you want the dissonance of a chord to be apparent, then the dissonant intervals have to be in similar sounding instruments. So we can use this concept to either enhance or to soften the dissonance in a particular chord. So let's take a look at a typical cluster. As a piano chord, it's thick and dissonant. This chord tries to soften the dissonance by having overlapping diminished triads in similar instruments. This next voicing accentuates the dissonance by having similar instruments play semitone clusters. And now all three in a row. Here's another chord that is dissonant on piano. But if we look at it harmonically, it's the overlapping of a C major 7 triad and a D sharp minor triad. So this first voicing has the strings with one chord and the flutes in the other. This next voicing accentuates the dissonance by having semitones in the flutes and in 2 places in the strings. And now arrange for 4 different instruments. And now all 4. And of course the differences are very subtle because we're talking about very tense chords. Another way to make larger chords is to take 2 or more smaller chords and stack them on top of each other. These are called polychords. For instance, I could take an A-flat triad, maybe down here, and underneath it put a C major triad. These kind of harmonies were used with the early American composers like Charles Ives and Aaron Copland. The more closely the chords are related in terms of keys, the more consonant the overall sound of the chord will be. I've always liked this sound, 2 major triads separated by an octave and a second. So here I have a D major triad underneath an E major triad and with a C in the bass. And the further away the chords are in terms of key, the more dissonant the chord will be. Here's the chord D flat, or C sharp major, over B over C. Now when we talk about these interactions, the interactions between notes are strongest when they are within an octave of each other. A major third is a stronger binding of those 2 notes than a major 10th, or 2 octaves and a third. Even if we put 3 octaves, it still feels happy major, but it's not as strong of a connection as when they're close together. Now the corollary of this is the same thing happens with dissonances. The minor second, the minor ninth, those 2 are very similar, but you start getting octaves between those notes, and it starts to sound a little less dissonant. Those 2 notes still don't fit together, but they don't sound anywhere near as dissonant as that. We can also introduce microtonal intervals to make large chords and clusters. The bottom few octaves of the harmonic overtone series is a large chord in just intonation. All the notes in the chord, except for the roots, are slightly out of tune compared to our 12-tone equal temperament. Quartertones and quartertone intervals come from the quartertone scale, an equal-tempered scale which divides the octave into 24 instead of 12 equal parts. It also introduces 4 new accidentals: the quartertone flat, the quartertone sharp, 3/4 of a tone flat, and 3/4 of a tone sharp. Here's an 8-note quartal chord built out of perfect fourths. Exactly half the distance of a perfect fourth is a tone plus a quartertone. So here's that same chord up a tone plus a quartertone. By layering these 2, we get a 16-part chord built out of the interval of a tone plus a quartertone. Here's a similar set of chords down a tone and at a louder dynamic. look at all the interactions in these chords, one of the most important intervals is the outer boundary note, the note on the very bottom of the chord and the very top of the chord. The note on the bottom of the chord traditionally is the root, and this is the note that gives context to all the other notes in the chord. The note on the top, because of the fact that it's the highest note, is usually the most prominent note in a chord. So the interval that happens between that top note and bottom note will have a lot to do with the overall perception of that chord as well. Even when using perfect fifths and fourths as stacked chords, eventually as these chords get bigger and bigger, the outer boundary notes eventually make dissonant notes. So there's a limit as to how many you can use in a row and still have it sound open. Because microtonal clusters are so tense, and we don't really clearly hear a lot of those intervals, anything smaller than a semitone just becomes a really tense, small, almost out of tune sound. What we really perceive is the overall density, how many notes there are in the chord, and what kind of interval those outer boundary notes make. I find this chord less tense than this chord, even though it has one more semitone in it, but the outer notes make a perfect fifth as opposed to an augmented fourth. Here is a quartertone cluster with 5 notes. The outer notes make the interval of a major second. It is a very tense chord. Now here's a similar chord with only 4 notes. The tension is pretty much the same, even though it has one less interaction, and I believe that's because the outer intervals comprise the interval of 3/4 of a tone, which is more dissonant than the major second. As we make stacked chords with smaller and smaller intervals, the overall size of the chord becomes smaller as well. An 8-note chord in thirds spans 2 octaves, whereas an 8-note whole note cluster spans an octave and a second. A semitone cluster of 8 notes spans a perfect fifth. A quartertone cluster of 8 notes spans a neutral third. Now once we get past that point, and we get into smaller and smaller clusters, for one thing, they stop sounding like chords. Here's an 8-note cluster of quartertones. Here's an 8-note cluster in sixth tones. And here's an 8-note cluster in eighth tones. These tight clusters start sounding less and less like chords. And I hear them, and I'm starting to think of them as multiple versions of a single note. And it's not really a chord. I call that one note with a fuzzy tuning. But that's a topic of conversation for another day. I hope you found this interesting. See you soon.